Throughout history, people have asked, how can I be a good person? What is virtue? How can I make the world a better place for the next generation? People have turned to religion, to spiritual awakening. People have turned to philosophy, ancient texts. In the modern era, some people have even tried to use math and science to answer this question. I want to suggest an approach based on historical analysis. I want to look at history, find out the mistakes people made in the past, and then learn to correct those mistakes. I believe if we look at history in this way, we can discern a pattern of repeated ethical failure through this historical analysis. I want to start by talking about a particularly insane episode in European history, which is the Crusades. This was when a bunch of Christian kings and popes and barons decided that it was really important that the Christians control the Holy Land. At this time, of course, the Holy Land, which is now places like Israel and Palestine, was controlled by the Muslims. The Europeans put together enormous armies, marched across land, sailed across the ocean until they finally reached the Holy Land, where they started fighting. A typical scenario was that the Christians would come to a city like Jerusalem or Antioch, lay siege to the city for a couple of months, during which time the defenders progressively starved to death. And then finally, the Crusaders would break into the city and start murdering everyone inside. Now, I started with this episode because the tension and the paradox is so palpable. On the one hand, you have this religion of peace and love and brotherhood, but at the same time, it's being used to justify these terrible acts of war and violence and oppression. Very similar theme comes up in the conquest of the Americas. This is basically the Spaniards conquering the New World. And Christianity played an important role in this conquest. The idea was, the way the Spaniards justified themselves was that they said, we're Christians, we have the right religion. We were chosen by God to spread that religion. And therefore, whatever we do that is violent or barbaric is totally justified because we have the right religion. Now, I do want to mention that I don't think most of the conquistadors were particularly devout. Mostly they wanted gold and plunder, but they were able to use Christianity to justify their actions to the rest of European society. Now, this is not a speech against Christianity. I want to move on to a different ideology. This is communism. The communists had a grand vision of creating an egalitarian society where there wasn't going to be huge discrepancies of wealth and power. The poor would not starve. We would not have these enormous disparities that we have in modern capitalist societies. What's interesting to me about Marxism is that it really is a rich, well-developed system of thought. There's books and papers about it. There is Marxist analysis of film and literature. It's really a comprehensive belief system. Now, of course, the communists totally failed in their objectives, and they ended up murdering millions of people, either by direct political repression, Stalin sending people to the gulags, or by famines that were caused by the bad policies. So again, the paradox of noble intentions, well-intentioned people trying to produce a better society, but falling into this trap of violence and war and oppression. When you study history and you start to see this pattern, it comes up again and again. So the next example is the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The French had these brilliant philosophers, Rousseau and Voltaire, people like that. They created a new way of thinking about society, and about how government should relate to the people. The French revolutionaries took up these ideas, pronounced their great slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and overthrew the government. Pretty soon after they took power, they started massacring the aristocrats. But that wasn't it. That wasn't the end of the bloodshed. The country was taken over by a military dictator. Because of all the instability, Napoleon was able to take control of the country. And Napoleon was really popular because he was good at winning wars. He would start wars with the neighbors of the French and really do great in the battlefield. And so that made him very popular. And the Napoleonic Wars plunged all of Europe into chaos and violence. And it culminated with the infamous invasion of Russia that Tolstoy wrote about, which of course led to millions of deaths, the burning of Moscow, starvation, famine, all of these terrible things. And again, the paradox of the noble intentions, liberty, equality, leading to violence and war. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that these examples are all from previous primitive societies. Okay, so here is an example from America. The American history, a certain moment, the 1800s, a very powerful idea was manifest destiny. And this concept was that America had the right system of beliefs. We had the right ideals. We had democracy. We had freedom. And that meant we should spread our country and our government across the entire continent, move into these Western lands, set them up as new states in the American system, even though there were already people living there. So walking through the thought process, the Americans of this time said, we have the right ideals. And even though there's some Native Americans, they're not very important. We can just conquer them or displace them or put them in camps because we've got the right ideas. All right. So again, we see the ideals and the ideology of liberty, democracy, leading to being justifications for war and violence. One final example is the Vietnam War. Vietnam was a war that happened in the 60s and 70s. The Americans at that time wanted to support the non-communist South Vietnamese government against the communist North Vietnamese. This war ended up costing 60,000 American deaths and 3 million Vietnamese deaths. You might ask, given that Vietnam is a small country, a poor country, literally on the other side of the planet from the United States, why did the Americans feel like they needed to get involved? Why? And the reason was this domino theory. So the domino theory said that if one country became communist, then another country neighboring it would be more likely to become communist. And so there would be this domino effect where more and more countries would become communist. And so the Americans had to intervene to stop this chain reaction of communist takeovers. Now that seems sort of maybe plausible, but there really wasn't any evidence for it. And obviously in retrospect, it was totally wrong. So here we have a incredible tension between the silliness and the flimsiness and the ridiculousness of this idea and the enormous war that resulted as a justification that was justified by that idea. Friends, I think that human history is plagued by this repeated pattern of ethical failure. You first start off by proclaiming a noble ideology with great intentions. Then something happens, and eventually the ideology becomes used to justify war and violence and oppression. What it means to me to be a good person is to be someone who stands up against ideology. It's very easy to dismiss the ideologies of the past but it's profoundly difficult to resist the belief system of your own nation. Humanity cannot escape from evil until the day arrives when many millions of people decide to resist ideology. Thank you very much.